The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and old magazines, a sterile silence that seemed to press against my chest. I sat there, perched on a green plastic chair that was as uncomfortable as the life I had been living for the last 6 months. Since Robert died, the world had lost its color. It felt like I was just waiting for my own time to run out. Then, the vibration in my purse startled me. I pulled out my phone and saw her name on the screen, Angela, my only daughter. My heart gave a little flutter of warmth, the kind only a mother feels, thinking she was calling to check on me before my appointment. But when I pressed the phone to my ear, the voice that spoke wasn't the daughter I had raised for 45 years. It was the voice of a stranger, cold and sharp as a winter wind. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask if I was scared to be at the doctor alone. She simply said, "Mom, we're going on a trip to Europe tomorrow. I've already sold your beach house and your car. Edward and I needed the money for an investment. Bye." The line went dead, just like that. A 45-second phone call to erase 45 years of sacrifice. I sat there in that crowded waiting room, surrounded by people, yet I had never felt more alone in my entire life. I thought of the beach house, our sanctuary. Robert and I had saved every penny from his bus driver salary and my years of frugal living to buy that place when Angela was 15. Every summer memory, every Christmas morning, the smell of salt air and the sound of her childhood laughter. She had turned it all into a stack of cash without even asking. And the truck, Robert's old Ford pickup. He used to wash it every Sunday as if it were a sacred ritual. His scent was still in those seats. To Angela, it was just metal and rubber. To me, it was the last place I could still feel him near me. I should have cried. I should have screamed. But as I sat there, a strange, icy calm washed over me. I took a deep breath and, to the surprise of the person sitting across from me, I smiled. It wasn't a smile of happiness, but a smile of realization. My daughter thought she had just stripped me of everything I owned. She thought she had left an old, grieving widow with nothing but the clothes on her back and a bus pass. But as I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of my phone, I remembered something. I remembered a manila envelope. 3 days before Robert's heart stopped, while we were sitting at the small kitchen table, he had slid a thick envelope across the wood. His hands were weathered from 40 years of gripping a steering wheel, but his eyes were as sharp as the day I met him. He told me to put it in my dresser drawer and to only open it when I felt ready, if something were to happen to him. In the fog of the funeral, the lawyers, and the crushing weight of grief, I had forgotten it existed. But now, with the sting of Angela's betrayal burning in my ears, the memory of that envelope was the only thing I could see. When the nurse finally called my name, I walked into the doctor's office like a woman in a trance. He checked my heart, he checked my blood pressure, and he told me I was remarkably healthy for 71. He told me I just needed to rest and eat better. I nodded and thanked him, but my mind was already 3 miles away, in the bottom drawer of my mahogany dresser. I walked out of that clinic and stood at the bus stop, watching the cars go by. My car was gone. My sanctuary was sold. But as the bus pulled up, I realized that Angela had made a fatal mistake. She had assumed I was a victim. She had assumed Robert was just a simple bus driver with a simple life. She was about to find out how wrong she was. I reached my house, the house that was still mine, for now, and went straight to the bedroom. My hands were trembling, not from age, but from an adrenaline I hadn't felt in decades. I pulled open the drawer, moved aside my scarves, and there it was, the manila envelope. Robert's neat, disciplined handwriting was on the front, Antonia Brooks. I sat on the edge of the bed we had shared for nearly half a century and tore the seal. Inside, there wasn't just a letter. There were deeds. There were bank certificates. There were corporate documents. As I began to read, the room seemed to grow brighter. Robert hadn't just been a bus driver. He had been a silent architect of a fortune. He had invested in properties, in businesses, and in land, all while we lived our quiet, modest life. And the biggest shock of all? The 20-story apartment building in the city center, the one where Angela and Edward lived in a luxury suite they bragged about. Robert didn't just own it. He had owned it for 10 years. And now, every brick, every window, and every cent of their rent belonged to me. That realization hit me like a physical wave, a mixture of profound grief for the man who had protected me so silently, and a cold, sharpening clarity regarding the daughter who had discarded me. I spent hours that night sitting on the floor of my bedroom, surrounded by the paper trail of Robert's secret life. The documents were organized with the same meticulous care he used when checking his bus routes. There were ledgers dating back 30 years, showing small investments that had snowballed into massive holdings. He hadn't been gambling, he had been building a fortress. And the most striking document was the deed to the Emerald Heights Tower. My daughter lived on the 15th floor, constantly complaining about the faceless corporate landlord who raised the rent or refused to allow certain renovations. She had no idea that the landlord was the father who sat at her table and ate meatloaf every Sunday. As the moon rose and cast long, skeletal shadows across the room, I read Robert's letter for the 10th time. His words were a warning from the grave. He knew Angela better than I wanted to admit. He had seen the influence of Edward, a man who saw people as rungs on a ladder rather than human beings. Robert had kept this wealth hidden because he wanted to see if our daughter would love us for our hearts or for our bank accounts. Sadly, she had just provided the answer. She thought I was a burden to be managed, a problem to be solved with a 30% payout and a one-way ticket to a small apartment that fits my needs. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours before dawn staring at the phone. Part of me wanted to call her, to scream that I owned the roof over her head, to demand she return the keys to my beach house. But a deeper, more resilient part of me, the part of me that had survived 45 years of life's ups and downs, told me to wait. If I struck now, I would only be reclaiming money. If I waited, I could reclaim my dignity. I watched the sun creep over the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. By 7 a.m., my plan was beginning to take shape. I wasn't just going to be a victim of her greed. I was going to be the architect of her lesson. The next morning, when the phone rang and I heard Angela's softened voice, I felt a surge of iron in my veins. Listening to her talk about fairness and investment opportunities in Europe, while she was effectively stealing my life's memories, was almost nauseating. She spoke to me like I was a child who didn't understand how the world worked. "We gave you 30%, Mom. That's fair, right?" The sheer audacity of her defining what was fair for my property made my skin crawl, but I kept my voice steady. I played the role of the submissive, grieving mother perfectly. I thanked her. I told her to have a safe trip. I let her hang up, thinking she had won. The moment the line went quiet, the mask dropped. I looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the tired, broken widow who had walked into the doctor's office yesterday. This woman had a mission. I went to the closet and pulled out my finest wine-colored dress. Robert always said that color made me look like royalty. I spent an hour on my hair, pinning it up with a precision I hadn't used in years. I applied my makeup with a steady hand. I was preparing for a different kind of funeral, the funeral of my daughter's arrogance. I didn't take the bus this time. I called a private car service. As I rode toward the city center, toward the prestigious law offices of Mr. Peterson, I looked out at the city Robert had navigated for 4 decades. He had seen every corner, every struggle, and every opportunity. He had been a king in a bus driver's uniform. When I arrived at the office, the receptionist looked at my dress and my posture and didn't see an old lady. She saw a client of importance. Mr. Peterson was a man of silver hair and sharp suits, a man who had known Robert for a long time. When he saw me enter, he stood up immediately, offering his condolences. But the moment I laid those manila folders on his desk, his professional veneer cracked. His eyes widened as he flipped through the bank certificates and the deeds. He looked at me, then at the papers, and then back at me. "Mrs. Brooks, I knew Robert was a prudent man, but this is an empire." He explained that the sale of the beach house was not just immoral, it was legally void. Angela had used a power of attorney that had been narrowed by Robert's later filings, which she clearly hadn't known about. She had committed fraud. "We can have the police at her door before she boards that flight to Europe, Antonia," Mr. Peterson said, his hand reaching for the telephone. "We can freeze every account she touched." I reached out and placed my hand over his, stopping him. No, Mr. Peterson, I said, my voice as calm as a still lake. I don't want her in a jail cell. Not yet. I want her to go to Europe. I want her to spend every cent of that 30% she thinks she's so generously sharing. I want her to feel the height of her success. I leaned forward, the fire of 45 years of suppressed strength burning in my eyes. And while she is at the very top, I want you to help me pull the ground out from under her. I want to buy back the beach house, yes, but more importantly, I want to become the most hands-on landlord Emerald Heights has ever seen. I want to change the locks on her life, but I want to do it while she's watching from across the ocean. Peterson stared at me for a long moment, a slow, admiring smile spreading across his face. You don't want a lawyer, Antonia. You want a general. I want justice, I replied. And I want to see if Edward's business opportunity is strong enough to survive when the bank accounts he's relying on suddenly turn to ice. The days that followed were a blur of calculated silence and hidden maneuvers. While Angela and Edward were likely sipping champagne in a first-class cabin over the Atlantic, I was sitting in Mr. Peterson's mahogany-paneled office, signing my name until my wrist ached. Each signature felt like a brick being laid in a fortress I was building around my future. Mr. Peterson worked with a quiet, ruthless efficiency. Within 48 hours, the fraudulent sale of the beach house was halted in its tracks. The buyers, a young couple who had no idea they were purchasing stolen memories, were compensated and turned away, and the deed was returned to its rightful place, under the name of Antonia Brooks. But that was only the beginning. The most delicate part of the plan involved the 20-story tower, Emerald Heights. Robert had owned it through a shell company called RB Heritage Holdings. To the world, and to the tenants, the owner was a faceless board of directors. I instructed Mr. Peterson to dissolve that anonymity. I wanted the management company to know that there was a new, active chairwoman. I wanted every repair request, every financial statement, and every lease agreement sent directly to my kitchen table. As I sat in my quiet house, the silence no longer felt heavy with grief. It felt sharp with anticipation. I began to review the file on apartment 15B, Angela and Edward's home. It was a sprawling 3-bedroom unit with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the harbor. The rent they paid was significantly below market value, a favor Robert had quietly arranged through the management company years ago, so his daughter wouldn't struggle. It broke my heart to realize that even while she was treating him like an embarrassment, he was subsidizing her luxury. I looked at the lease agreement. It was month to month, a precarious position Edward had insisted on because he always thought they'd be moving on to bigger and better things. Mr. Peterson, I said over the phone, my eyes fixed on the sunset. I want a formal notice of rent increase drafted for apartment 15B, not a small increase. I want it brought to the absolute maximum the law allows. And I want a full inspection of the premises scheduled for next week. If there are any unauthorized renovations, and I know Edward has knocked down a wall or two, I want a notice of violation served immediately. I could hear the smile in Peterson's voice. That will certainly get their attention, Antonia. But they are in Europe. They won't see the physical mail for weeks. Exactly, I replied. I want the debt to pile up while they are distracted by their investments. I want them to feel completely secure until the moment they realize they have no ground to stand on. To occupy my time, I visited the beach house. I took a taxi out to the coast, my heart thumping as the smell of salt spray filled the air. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw a "sold" sign with a "canceled" sticker slapped across it. I walked up to the porch and sat in the old wooden rocker Robert had repaired a dozen times. The house felt empty, but not abandoned. I realized then that Angela hadn't just sold a building. She had tried to sell my soul. She had tried to sell the place where Robert's laughter still echoed in the hallways. I spent the afternoon cleaning. I polished the wood, opened the windows to let the sea breeze blow out the stale air of betrayal, and sat on the deck watching the waves. I thought about the 30% they had given me. I hadn't touched a cent of it. In fact, I had Mr. Peterson move it into a separate escrow account. I didn't want their tainted money. I wanted my own life back. That evening, I received a notification on my phone, a social media post from Angela. It was a photo of her and Edward in front of the Eiffel Tower. They were holding glasses of wine, looking radiant and wealthy. The caption read, "Finally living the life we deserve. Out with the old, in with the new. Europe isn't ready for us." I stared at the screen, at the daughter I had nursed through fevers and cheered for at graduations. "Out with the old," I whispered to the empty room. She was referring to me. I was the old that had been discarded so she could have her French wine and designer bags. A cold shiver went down my spine, but it wasn't fear. It was the final hardening of my heart. The woman who would have forgiven anything was gone. "Mr. Peterson," I called him back late that night. "I've changed my mind about waiting for them to return. I want to begin the eviction process for non-compliance of the lease regarding the structural changes Edward made. I want them to receive the legal notice via email and physical delivery to their European hotel. I want them to know, while they are standing in the middle of their dream, that their home is no longer their own." "Antonia," Peterson cautioned, "this will start a war." "No, Mr. Peterson," I said, looking at the photo of Robert on my bedside table. "The war started in a doctor's waiting room. This is simply the closing argument." The move was swift and silent, like a shadow passing over a sleeping city. Mr. Peterson's team moved with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. By the time the sun rose on Monday morning, the legal machinery was in full gear. I sat in my small kitchen, the one Angela had called shabby and depressing, sipping a cup of black coffee. On the table before me was the proof of my new reality, a digital dashboard showing the real-time status of the Brooks estate. I watched as the emails were dispatched. We had tracked their itinerary through Angela's boastful social media updates. They were staying at a boutique hotel in the 6th arrondissement of Paris. At exactly 10 a.m. Paris time, the notification hit her inbox. It wasn't a "thinking of you" message from her mother. It was a formal notice of lease termination and a demand for immediate restoration of property. I could almost imagine the scene. Angela, draped in some expensive silk robe she'd bought with the beach house money, sitting on a balcony overlooking the Seine, expecting a confirmation of some business deal. Instead, she was reading that her luxury lifestyle back in the States was crumbling. The notice detailed the unauthorized removal of a load-bearing wall in apartment 15B, a renovation Edward had bragged about during a Christmas dinner 2 years ago, thinking I was too old to understand the structural risks. It also informed them that the rent subsidy, which they had enjoyed for a decade, was being revoked effective immediately, and the arrears for the market value difference were being billed to their account. By noon, my phone began to vibrate. It was Angela. I didn't answer. It vibrated again 10 minutes later. Then a text message flashed. "Mom, pick up the phone. Something is wrong with the apartment management. They're crazy. They're threatening to evict us. Call me now." I let the phone sit on the lace doily Robert's mother had made. I watched the screen light up over and over again. It was a strange sensation, not one of cruelty, but of a profound, detached justice. For months, I had been the one calling her, hoping for a few minutes of her time, only to be told she was too busy or exhausted. Now the roles had shifted. My silence was my power. I spent the afternoon at the bank. Now that the manila envelope had revealed the truth, I had to formalize my control over the liquid assets. The bank manager, a woman who had seen me come in for years to deposit small checks, nearly fell out of her chair when she saw the corporate authorizations. She moved me from the teller line to a private, velvet-walled office in the back. "Mrs. Brooks," she said, her voice hushed with a new level of respect. "We had no idea you were the primary signatory for the RB Heritage accounts. These funds have been sitting in low-yield holding for quite some time. Would you like to discuss a more aggressive growth strategy?" "No," I said, leaning back in the plush chair. "I want to discuss liquidity. I want to ensure that certain credit lines, specifically those tied to Edward's business ventures, are reviewed for collateral sufficiency." Robert had been a genius. He hadn't just invested in buildings, he had quietly provided the seed money for the very firm Edward worked for, acting as an anonymous silent partner. Edward thought he was a self-made man of finance. He had no clue his career was built on the back of his father-in-law's bus driving shifts. "Check the loan covenants for Apex Consulting," I directed. If there is any change in the majority ownership of the parent company, do the loans have an acceleration clause? The manager tapped away at her keyboard. Her eyebrows shot up. Yes, Mrs. Brooks. In the event of a transfer of the primary trust, which just happened when your husband passed and you claimed the estate, the bank has the right to call the loans within 30 days if a new guarantee isn't signed. Don't send the notice yet, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. Wait until they are in Italy. I want them to be at the most expensive part of their trip when the credit cards start to decline. I left the bank feeling lighter than I had in years. I went to a high-end boutique, the kind of place Angela always told me I was too frumpy for. I bought a coat of soft charcoal cashmere and a pair of leather gloves. I wasn't just Antonia the widow anymore. I was Antonia the owner. When I got home, there were 17 missed calls. I finally picked up on the 18th. "Mom, thank God!" Angela's voice was hysterical. I could hear the wind of a Parisian street in the background. "Did you see my messages? Some lawyer named Peterson is claiming he represents the owner of our building, and he's kicking us out. He's saying the sale of the beach house was invalid. Mom, you have to tell them. Tell them you gave us permission." "Angela," I said, my voice as smooth as the silk of my new coat. "I'm sorry, dear. I'm just a 71-year-old woman who needs a small apartment that fits my needs, remember? I don't think I have the authority to tell a big, powerful company like RB Heritage what to do." "Mom, don't be like that. This is Edward's reputation on the line. They're saying we committed fraud. Just call this Peterson guy and tell him it's a misunderstanding." "I can't do that, Angela," I said softly, "because it isn't a misunderstanding. It's an audit. And by the way, how is Paris? I hope the wine is worth the price of your soul." I hung up before she could scream. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The following week was a study in the power of patience. While the digital world allowed Angela to scream at me through text messages and frantic voicemails from across the ocean, I chose to inhabit the physical world. I moved a few of my belongings back to the beach house. I didn't need much, just Robert's favorite books, my sewing kit, and the old photo albums that Angela had nearly tossed into the trash during her cleanup of my life. Being back in the sanctuary of the beach house felt like reuniting with an old friend. I spent my mornings on the porch, wrapped in my new cashmere coat, watching the tide pull the shore into the sea. It was a metaphor for my life. The old sand was being washed away to reveal the solid rock beneath. But while I was finding peace, the storm I had unleashed was finally making landfall in Europe. Mr. Peterson called me on Wednesday afternoon. "Antonia, the pressure is mounting. Edward's firm has received the notice regarding the loan acceleration. Apparently, Edward had used his expected inheritance and the projected profits from the beach house sale as collateral for a new venture in London. Now that the sale has been flagged as fraudulent and the primary estate is in your name, the bank has frozen his corporate credit line. They are stranded." I took a slow sip of my tea. Stranded? That sounds expensive. "Extremely," Peterson chuckled. "They were supposed to check out of their Paris hotel this morning to head to Venice. According to my contact, their cards were declined at the front desk. Angela has been calling the management company of the apartment building every hour, demanding to speak to the real owner. She still hasn't put the pieces together. She thinks I'm too simple to be the owner," I said. "She thinks Robert was just a man who drove a bus and came home to eat his dinner in silence. She never looked at him long enough to see the brilliance in his eyes. Let her keep guessing for a few more days." But I knew I couldn't stay in the shadows forever. The climax was approaching. I directed Mr. Peterson to arrange a video conference. I wanted it to happen on Friday. I wanted them to be tired, stressed, and desperate. I wanted them to be sitting in a cramped hotel room, wondering how their gilded life had turned to lead in a matter of days. The night before the call, I went into Robert's old study at the beach house. I sat at his desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a small velvet box I hadn't seen in years. It contained a set of keys, not just any keys, but the original master keys to every property Robert had acquired. He had kept them as a hobby, a physical reminder of the empire he had built with his own 2 hands. I held them in my hand, feeling their weight. These weren't just pieces of metal. They were the keys to my freedom. Friday morning arrived with a crisp, clear sky. I sat in Mr. Peterson's office, positioned perfectly in front of a high-definition camera. I wore a string of pearls Robert had given me for our 30th anniversary and my wine-colored dress. I looked every bit the chairwoman of RB Heritage Holdings. When the screen flickered to life, I saw Angela and Edward. They looked terrible. Angela's hair was unwashed, and Edward's face was flushed with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. They were sitting in what looked like a budget hotel room, a far cry from the luxury suites they had been posting on Instagram. "Finally!" Angela shouted as soon as the connection stabilized. "Mr. Peterson? Is the owner there? We need this sorted out immediately. My mother is a witness. She can tell you that the beach house was—" She stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes traveled from the lawyer to the woman sitting next to him. She squinted at the screen, her mouth hanging open. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing in that office? Why are you dressed like that?" I leaned forward, my face filling the frame. I didn't look angry. I looked disappointed, which I knew would hurt her far more. "Hello, Angela. Hello, Edward. I hear the weather in Europe is a bit chilly this time of year." "Mom, what is going on?" Angela's voice rose to a screech. "Why is Peterson with you? Tell him to fix the credit cards. Tell him to stop the eviction. We're going to be homeless." "You aren't homeless yet, Angela," I said calmly. "You still have 30% of the sale of a house you didn't own, right? That should buy you a few nights in a hostel. Although I imagine the legal fees for the fraud charges will eat into that quite quickly." Edward shoved his way into the frame, his eyes bulging. "Antonia, listen to me. You don't know what you're doing. You're meddling in high-level business. That building, Emerald Heights, it's owned by a major holding company. You're just a widow. Get off the phone and let us talk to the principal." I looked at Mr. Peterson, who gave me a sharp, respectful nod. Then I looked back at the screen. "Edward," I said, "I am the principal. I am the holding company. I am the owner of the roof over your head, the office where you work, and the very air you're breathing in that apartment you've so carelessly renovated without my permission. My name is Antonia Brooks, and as of this moment, your lease is terminated, your loans are called, and your vacation is over." The silence on the other end of the line was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The screen stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity. I watched as the color drained from Edward's face, turning him a sickly shade of gray that matched the drab walls of their budget hotel. Angela just stared, her eyes darting between me and the legal documents Mr. Peterson held up to the camera. It was the look of someone watching their entire reality shatter into a million jagged pieces. The frail, grieving widow they thought they could manipulate had vanished, replaced by the woman who held their entire future in the palm of her hand. "That's impossible," Edward finally stammered, his voice cracking. "Robert was a bus driver. He was a man who loved his family enough to build an empire in silence, Edward," I interrupted, my voice steady and cold. "And he was a man who saw through you from the very first day you stepped into our home. He didn't hide this wealth because he was greedy. He hid it because he wanted to see if his daughter had a heart, or if she just had a price tag. And you, Angela, you finally showed us the price." Angela began to sob, but they weren't the tears of a daughter who was sorry for hurting her mother. They were the hysterical tears of a woman who had just realized she had lost her golden goose. "Mom, please. We were just trying to grow the family's wealth. Edward said we needed to be aggressive, that you didn't understand modern finance. We did it for all of us." "You sold my husband's truck, Angela," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "You sold the last thing I had that smelled like him. You sold the house where we taught you how to walk. You didn't do it for us. You did it because you thought I was a nuisance to be discarded. You thought I was an old woman who would sit quietly in the corner of a tiny apartment and wait to die. But as you can see, I am very much alive." Mr. Peterson stepped forward, his professional mask back in place. "As of this moment," he announced to the camera, "RB Heritage Holdings has initiated the bad faith clause in your lease. Due to the structural damage caused by your unauthorized renovations and the fraudulent activity involving the beach house, You are being given 48 hours to have your belongings removed from apartment 15B. Since you are currently out of the country, a bonded moving crew will pack your items and place them in a secure storage facility. The keys to that facility will be released only after the restoration costs for the apartment are paid in full. 48 hours? Angela screamed. We're in Paris. We can't get back that fast. All our things, my jewelry, my designer bags. They will be handled with the same care you showed my memories, I said. Which is to say, they will be handled like cargo. And as for your flight home, I hope you kept some of that 30% you were so proud of, because your corporate travel accounts have been flagged for unauthorized use. You're on your own now. Edward tried to speak, tried to use that oily, persuasive tone he had used on me for years, but I had already seen behind the curtain. I nodded to Mr. Peterson, who reached out and ended the call. The screen went black, cutting off Angela's desperate pleas mid-sentence. The silence in the office was heavy, but it wasn't unpleasant. I leaned back in the chair and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since the day Robert died. My hands weren't trembling anymore. I felt a strange sense of completion. "What's the next step, Antonia?" Peterson asked, watching me with a mix of curiosity and awe. "I want to go to Emerald Heights," I said. "I want to see the view from the 15th floor. I want to see exactly what they were so willing to betray me for." As I left the office, I didn't feel like a victim seeking revenge. I felt like a woman reclaiming her name. I hailed a car and drove to the city center. When we pulled up to the glass and steel tower of Emerald Heights, the doorman, who had seen me many times before as a visitor who wasn't allowed to stay too late, stood up straight. He didn't know who I was yet, but he could sense the change in the air. I took the elevator to the 15th floor. I used the master key from Robert's desk to open the door to 15B. The apartment was beautiful. Wide open spaces, marble countertops, and a view that stretched out over the harbor. But it felt cold. It felt like a monument to vanity. I walked through the rooms, seeing the ghosts of the holidays I had spent there, cleaning their kitchen and cooking their meals while they ignored me. I stopped in the living room, where Edward had knocked down the wall to improve the flow. It was a scar on Robert's building. I sat on their expensive leather sofa and looked out at the city. For 45 years, I had been the support system, the sacrifice, and the quiet background of their lives. Now, I was the storm. I picked up the house phone and dialed the building manager. "This is Antonia Brooks," I said. "I'm in 15B. I want a contractor here within the hour. We're going to rebuild the walls, and after that, I want to talk about turning the penthouse into a community center for the elderly. It's time this building had a little more soul." The days following the confrontation were filled with a quiet, industrious rhythm. While the legal machinery continued to dismantle Edward's professional standing and Angela's sense of security, I focused on the restoration of my own world. I didn't stay at the apartment for long. Its air was too thick with the scent of their arrogance. Instead, I returned to the beach house, the place that truly held the echoes of my life with Robert. Mr. Peterson arrived on Thursday afternoon with a stack of papers and a look of grim satisfaction. He sat across from me on the porch, the sound of the Atlantic waves providing a rhythmic backdrop to our conversation. "The fallout is significant, Antonia," he began, opening his briefcase. "Edward's firm has officially terminated his partnership. They couldn't ignore the fraud allegations, especially when the victim was the primary investor behind their credit lines. He's essentially radioactive in the financial sector now." I nodded, watching a seagull dip toward the water. "And Angela?" "She's been calling the office incessantly," Peterson said. "They managed to scrape together the funds for a flight back, but they didn't return to the city. They're staying at a motel near the airport. It seems their friends in the high society circles have suddenly become very hard to reach. Without the Emerald Heights address and the luxury car, they've lost their social currency." It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing my daughter's entire identity was built on the shaky foundation of things that weren't hers. I felt a twinge of the old motherly instinct to protect her, to fix it, but I suppressed it. To fix this for her now would be to rob her of the only lesson that could ever save her soul. "I want you to send her a message, Mr. Peterson," I said. "Not a legal notice, just a message. Tell her I will meet her, Sunday morning, At the cemetery. Sunday was a gray, misty morning. The graveyard was silent, the headstones standing like patient sentinels in the fog. I arrived early and stood by Robert's grave. I had brought fresh flowers, the deep red roses he always used to bring home for me on Fridays, just because. Standing there, I didn't feel the crushing weight of the widowhood I had carried for 6 months. I felt like I was standing beside him, a partner once more. I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew the sound of her footsteps, even if they were heavier and more hesitant than they used to be. "Mom?" Angela's voice was small, stripped of the condescension and the coldness. I turned to see her. She looked exhausted. The designer clothes were wrinkled, and the expensive bag she had bragged about was clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. Edward was nowhere to be seen. "You came," I said simply. "I didn't have anywhere else to go," she whispered, her eyes red-rimmed. "Mom, please. We have nothing. The bank took the car back. The storage unit fee is more than we have left. He's a wreck. He's blaming me for everything. He says if I hadn't pushed him to sell the beach house, none of this would have happened." I looked at the headstone. Robert always said that character is revealed in a storm, not in the sunshine. It seems Edward's character is as hollow as I suspected. But what about yours, Angela? Who are you when you don't have my house to sell or my money to spend? "I'm your daughter," she cried, taking a step toward me. "Doesn't that count for anything? After everything you and Dad did for me, you're just going to let me starve?" "Everything we did for you," I repeated, the irony taste-testing like ash. "We gave you a life of comfort. We gave you a father who worked double shifts for 40 years so you could have the best of everything. And in return, you didn't even wait for his grave to settle before you tried to sell his memory. You didn't just sell a house, Angela. You tried to sell your father's love. You can't put a price on that and then ask for a refund when the check bounces." She fell to her knees in the damp grass, sobbing. It was a pathetic sight, but I didn't reach out to comfort her. Not yet. She needed to feel the coldness of the ground she had tried to pull out from under me. "I have a proposal for you," I said, my voice cutting through her sobs. "I have set up a trust. It isn't much, just enough for a modest one-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood and a small monthly stipend for basic living expenses. It is contingent on one thing. You must find a job, a real job, and you must attend counseling. If you try to contact Edward or use a single cent of that money to fund his investments, the trust dissolves instantly." She looked up, hope and desperation warring in her eyes. "And the building? Emerald Heights? Can I stay there?" "No," I said firmly. "Emerald Heights is being converted. The top floor is becoming a foundation for elderly women who have been abandoned by their families. You are not welcome there. You need to learn how to build a life with your own hands, just like your father did. If you can do that, if you can prove to me over the next year that you are more than just a parasite, then perhaps we can talk about being mother and daughter again. But for now, you are just a tenant in a world you no longer own." I placed the roses on Robert's grave and walked away, leaving her crying in the mist. As I reached the gate, I looked back one last time. She was still on her knees. For the first time in 45 years, I wasn't carrying her burden. I was finally walking free. The weeks that followed my meeting at the cemetery were the quietest I had known in my entire life. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape that was changed but remarkably clear. I spent my days at the beach house, not as a woman hiding from the world, but as a woman reclaiming it. I began to realize that for 45 years I had lived in Robert's shadow, a shadow I loved, but a shadow nonetheless. Now I was stepping into the light he had so carefully prepared for me. Mr. Peterson arrived one afternoon with a final report on the transition. We sat in the kitchen, the sun streaming through the windows, hitting the old wooden table where Robert and I had shared so many thousands of breakfasts. "The trust for Angela is active," Peterson said, sliding a folder toward me. "She has moved into the apartment in the suburbs. It's clean, safe, but very basic. According to the social worker I hired to monitor her progress, she started working as a receptionist at a local clinic. She's struggling, Antonia. She's never had to budget for groceries or pay an electric bill on her own." "Good," I said, and I meant it. If it isn't hard, she won't learn. If I give her a cushion, she'll just go back to sleep. How is the situation with Edward? Peterson took a slow sip of his coffee. He's gone. As soon as he realized there was no way to access your funds or the properties, he filed for divorce. He's moved out of state, likely looking for another target to fund his ventures. Angela was devastated, but I suspect it's the best thing that ever happened to her. He was a poison she didn't know she was drinking. I felt a pang of sadness for my daughter. To lose your husband and your lifestyle in 1 month is a heavy blow. But then I remembered her cold voice on the phone. I already sold your beach house and your car. I remembered the way she had looked at me as a bank account rather than a human being. The sadness didn't disappear, but it found its proper place, secondary to the truth. And Emerald Heights? I asked. Peterson's eyes lit up. The conversion is underway. We've partnered with a non-profit that specializes in senior advocacy. The 15th and 16th floors are being turned into communal living spaces for women who have lost their homes or been displaced. We're calling it the Robert Brooks Legacy. It's becoming the talk of the city, Antonia. You've turned a symbol of corporate greed into a sanctuary. I smiled at that. Robert would have liked that. He spent his life driving people from one destination to another, making sure they got where they needed to go. Now, his hard work was giving people a permanent place to stay. I decided to take a trip. Not to Europe, and not to buy things I didn't need. I drove, in a new, modest car I bought for myself, to the small town where Robert and I grew up. I visited the old park where we used to sit on the swings and talk about the future. I sat there for a long time, watching the children play. I realized that Robert's secret hadn't just been about money, it had been about time. He had bought me the time to figure out who I was without him, and the resources to make sure I was never anyone's victim again. One evening, a few months later, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was Angela. My heart did that familiar little skip, but this time, it was guarded. I answered. "Hello, Angela." "Hi, Mom," she said. Her voice was different. It wasn't the cold, sharp tone from the waiting room, and it wasn't the hysterical sobbing from the cemetery. It was tired. It was humbled. I just finished my shift. I'm walking home and I saw a flower shop. They had those little yellow daisies you used to plant in the garden." "I remember those," I said softly. "I realized I never asked you how your doctor's appointment went," she whispered. "That day, at the clinic, I was so focused on the money and Edward and getting away, I never asked if you were okay." I felt a lump in my throat. It was a small thing, a very small thing, but it was the first piece of genuine humanity I had heard from her in years. "I'm healthy, Angela. The doctor said I have a strong heart." "You do," she said, and I could hear the tears in her voice. "You have a much stronger heart than I do. I'm so sorry, Mom. I don't care about the money anymore. I miss Dad, and I miss you." "I miss the girl you used to be, Angela," I replied, "but I like the woman who's working for her own life a lot more. Keep going, one day at a time." I hung up the phone and looked out at the ocean. The sun was setting, casting a long golden path across the water. I wasn't the same woman I was when I sat in that doctor's office. I was Antonia Brooks. I was 71 years old. I was a widow, a mother, and a titan of industry. But most of all, I was finally, truly myself. As the months turned into a full year, the Robert Brooks Legacy Center at Emerald Heights officially opened its doors. I stood in the lobby, surrounded by gleaming marble and the warm scent of fresh lilies, watching women my age move into rooms that were more than just apartments. They were declarations of dignity. Many of them had arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a lifetime of stories that no one wanted to hear. Here, they were heard. Here, they were home. I had moved into a modest but elegant suite on the top floor of the building. I kept the beach house for weekends, but the city was where the work was. I had become a woman of business, though not the kind Edward would have understood. I spent my mornings reviewing the foundation's outreach programs and my afternoons visiting the tenants. I learned that wealth, when used as a weapon, only destroys, but when used as a bridge, it can save a soul. One Tuesday afternoon, a letter arrived. It wasn't a legal document or a bill. It was a simple, hand-addressed envelope from Angela. Since our last phone call, we had spoken once a week, short, polite conversations that felt like two people learning a foreign language. She had stayed at her job at the clinic. She had stayed in her small apartment. And, as far as Mr. Peterson's reports showed, she hadn't seen Edward since the day the divorce papers were served. I opened the letter with a steady hand. "Dear Mom," it began. "Today was my 1-year anniversary at the clinic. They gave me a small promotion. I'm a lead coordinator now. It's not much compared to the life I used to brag about, but for the first time, I feel like I actually earned the chair I'm sitting in. I spent the morning looking at old photos of Dad. I found one of him in his bus driver uniform, standing in front of the old terminal. He's smiling so wide. I never realized how tired he must have been, or how much he was doing behind the scenes. I was so blind, Mom. I'm starting to realize that the shabby life you lived was actually the most beautiful thing in the world, because it was real. I don't expect you to forgive me yet, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to be someone you and Dad would be proud of. Love, Angela." I folded the letter and tucked it into my dresser, right next to Robert's manila envelope. I felt a warmth in my chest that no amount of money could buy. It was the warmth of hope. That evening, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I walked down to the city's main bus terminal. I stood there as the large blue and white buses pulled in and out, the hiss of the air brakes and the smell of diesel bringing back a flood of memories. I watched the drivers climb down from their seats, their faces weary but their eyes searching the crowd for their loved ones. I saw a young man, probably no older than 25, step off his bus. He looked exhausted, his uniform rumpled. A woman and a small child were waiting for him. The child ran to him, shouting, "Daddy!" and the man's entire face transformed. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a love so fierce it made my eyes sting. I realized then that Robert had seen this every day. He had seen the heart of the city, the workers, the dreamers, the parents struggling to make a better life. He hadn't invested in property because he wanted power. He had invested in it because he understood the value of a foundation. He knew that everyone needs a place to come home to. I walked over to the young driver as his family embraced him. "Excuse me," I said softly. He looked up, surprised to be addressed by a woman in a charcoal cashmere coat. "Yes, ma'am?" "You're doing a wonderful job," I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out a small, gold-embossed card for the Brooks Foundation. "If you or your family ever find yourselves in a position where the rent is too high or the walls are closing in, you come to Emerald Heights and ask for Antonia. We look out for our own." The man looked confused, but his wife took the card with a grateful nod. I walked away before they could ask questions. I felt Robert's presence beside me more strongly than ever. It wasn't just his money that was changing the city, it was his spirit. When I returned to my suite at the Heights, the sun was setting, painting the harbor in shades of fire and gold. I sat by the window and watched the lights of the city flicker on, one by one. I thought about the 30% that Angela had given me from the sale of my own things. I had finally decided what to do with it. I had instructed Mr. Peterson to use that specific amount of money, every cent of it, to create a scholarship for the children of bus drivers in the city. It would be called the Robert Brooks Forward Fund. The irony was perfect. The money Angela tried to steal to fund her escape to Europe would now fund the education of children who would grow up to build the world, not tear it down. As I prepared for bed, the phone on my nightstand chimed. It was a text from Angela. "Mom, can I come visit you this weekend? Not for money, not for a favor. I'd like to see the building. I'd like to see what you've built." I stared at the message for a long time. The wall I had built around my heart was strong. It had to be to survive her betrayal. But a wall without a gate is just a prison. "Yes, Angela," I typed back. "Come on Saturday. We'll have coffee and cream, just like your father used to make." I turned off the lamp and lay back in the quiet. I was ready. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just Antonia the wife or Antonia the mother. I was the architect of my own destiny. Saturday morning arrived with a stillness that felt like a long-awaited blessing. I stood in the kitchen of my suite at Emerald Heights. the same ritual I had performed for 45 years now, taking on a new significance. I set the table with the old porcelain cups, the ones with the delicate blue flowers that had survived every move and every heartbreak. I poured the cream into a small silver pitcher. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air, a warm, grounding aroma that bridged the gap between the past and the present. When the doorbell rang, my heart didn't race with the anxiety it once had. I walked to the door and opened it to find Angela standing there. She wasn't the polished, arrogant woman who had boarded a plane for Paris. She looked simpler, her face devoid of the heavy makeup she used to wear like a mask. In her hands, she held a small potted yellow daisy, a living echo of the letter she had sent. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Come in, Angela," I replied, stepping aside. She walked into the suite, her eyes widening as she took in the view of the city. But she didn't comment on the luxury or the prestige. Instead, her gaze fell on a framed photograph on the mantel, a picture of Robert sitting in his old Ford pickup, one hand on the wheel, a mischievous glint in his eye. She walked over to it and touched the glass with a trembling finger. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she said, her back to me. "I'm so incredibly sorry for everything. I didn't just lose my way. I lost my soul for a while. I thought money was the only thing that made people respect you. I didn't realize that Dad was the most respected man I knew, and he never asked for a dime of credit." I sat at the table and motioned for her to join me. "Sit, Angela. The coffee is getting cold." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the clinking of spoons against porcelain. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people rebuilding a bridge, brick by agonizing brick. "I visited the 15th floor on my way up," Angela said, looking down at her cup. "I saw the signs for the community center. I saw the women in the lounge. They looked happy. They looked safe. I realized that if I had succeeded in what I tried to do, those women wouldn't be there. You wouldn't be here. It would just be another empty luxury floor for people like Edward." "Robert always said that a building is just a pile of bricks until you put people inside who care about each other," I said. "He built this empire so that I would never be afraid, but I think in his heart, he hoped it would eventually teach you not to be afraid of being humble, too." Angela reached across the table, her hand hovering tentatively. I met her halfway, closing my fingers around hers. Her skin was rougher now, the result of real work, and to me, it felt more honest than the soft, pampered hands she'd had before. "I'm not asking for my old life back, Mom," she said, looking me in the eye. "I like the person I'm becoming, even if she's tired and broke most of the time, but I want to be part of your life, not the estate, not the properties, just you." "That is the only thing I ever wanted, Angela," I replied. As the afternoon light faded, I took her on a tour of the building. We walked through the communal gardens, the library, and the clinic we had established on the ground floor. For the first time, I didn't see jealousy in her eyes. I saw pride. When we reached the lobby, I stopped in front of the bronze plaque near the entrance. It bore Robert's name and a simple quote, "The journey doesn't end at the last stop." "He's still here, isn't he?" Angela asked. "He's in every person who finds a home here," I said, "and he's in every choice we make to be better than we were yesterday." I watched her walk out to the street to catch the bus back to her apartment. She didn't call a private car. She didn't complain about the wait. She just stood at the stop, a regular person among regular people, a daughter finally finding her way home. I returned to my suite and sat by the window. The city lights were beginning to twinkle, a sea of stars mirrored on the dark earth. I looked at the manila envelope, now empty but still precious, resting on my desk. "My name is Antonia Brooks. I am 71 years old. I have lost the love of my life, but I have found the strength he left behind for me. I have a daughter who is learning to walk again, and a city that feels a little bit kinder because of a bus driver who knew how to dream in silence." I took a deep breath, the salt air from the distant coast seemingly reaching all the way to my balcony. The betrayal was over, the justice was served, and as I closed my eyes, I could almost hear Robert's voice, a gentle whisper in the evening breeze, saying the only words that mattered. "Good job, my love. You're ready now." I smiled, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely, beautifully at peace.